Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm really excited to get into this one. So, we often approach problem solving, whether it's in our personal lives or our careers, with this expectation of, engineered precision.
Right. Oh, absolutely. We want a formula.
Exactly. Like you break a bone, the x-ray reveals a jagged white line, the doctor points right to the fracture, and boom, the path to healing is immediately mapped out in plaster. It's entirely visible. It's comfortably objective.
Right. It's a physical, tangible fix.
But when you transition away from the physical and step into the landscape of the human mind, into the dense topography of grief, existential anxiety, and chronic overthinking, that diagnostic machinery just fails completely.
It really does.
We are suddenly navigating these incredibly murky psychological waters where the ailments are invisible and the cures are even more obscure.
It is the ultimate diagnostic ambiguity, really. And the most remarkable aspect of navigating this ambiguity is that our most profound manual for surviving it isn't, some modern textbook of clinical psychology or behavioral economics.
Right. It's a play.
Yeah. It's a dramatic text written at the turn of the 17th century. So our endeavor today is to extract the enduring, life-altering wisdom embedded in William Shakespeare's The Tragedy of Hamlet, Prince of Denmark.
Which is huge.
It is, but we are not reading this in a vacuum. Our guide through this psychological labyrinth today is the brilliant, incredibly piercing commentary of the 19th century essayist and critic, William Hazlitt.
Okay, so we really need to establish the parameters of this deep dive for you, the listener, right at the outset. Because look, if you are harboring any residual trauma from high school literature classes...
I don't think we all are.
Right, where the focus was just memorizing the meter of iambic pentameter or, identifying the rising action for a multiple choice test, you need to discard that framework entirely today.
Please throw it out.
We are interacting with this text as the definitive blueprint of the overactive human mind. It is a mirror held up to the very specific traps we build for ourselves when our intellect basically outpaces our capacity for action.
And Hazlitt provides just the perfect philosophical lens for this approach. He famously declared, "It is we who are Hamlet."
I love that quote.
It's so good. He argued fiercely against confining the reality of the play to just a wood stage in London or, the fictional stone walls of Elsinore Castle in Denmark. The true, terrifying reality of the play, Hazlitt insists, exists exclusively within the reader's mind.
Wow, within our own minds.
Exactly. So the objective today is to map how this centuries-old exploration of a fractured psyche flawlessly and sometimes brutally mirrors the complexities and anxieties of navigating modern existence.
That quote, "It is we who are Hamlet," it forces a very uncomfortable self-examination because Hazlitt is making a profound psychological claim there. He asserts that Hamlet's ruling passion is to think, not to act. And that brings us directly into the core wisdom of this text, which is the absolute paralysis of overthinking. Hazlitt portrays Hamlet not as the hardened, decisive warrior his father was, but as this, princely novice.
Right. He's a student at Wittenberg. He's steeped in philosophy, full of high enthusiasm and quick sensibility. But his capacity for action has been completely cannibalized by his intellect.
Cannibalized? That is such a strong word for it.
Cannibalized is the precise term, I think. To understand the mechanism of this paralysis, we have to look at the psychological profile Hazlitt constructs. Hamlet is caught in this endless loop of refining his own feelings and questioning fortune.
He's stuck.
He is. He doesn't act upon his circumstances. He becomes the sport of them. His intellectual machinery is so sophisticated, so adept at analyzing every possible outcome, every variable, every moral implication, that the physical mechanism of actually taking decisive action simply atrophies.
And the ultimate manifestation of this is the famous mousetrap play, right? We all know the setup. Hamlet needs empirical proof that his uncle Claudius murdered his father.
He refuses to just take the ghost's word for it.
Exactly. Which, on the surface, seems incredibly rational. So he stages this hyper-specific theatrical sting operation. He has the traveling players perform the murder of Gonzago, and he famously doctors the script to mimic the exact method of his father's assassination, poison poured into the ear of a sleeping king.
He essentially constructs a psychological pressure cooker. He instructs his friend Horatio to observe the king with maximum scrutiny, stating that if Claudius's occulted guilt doesn't reveal itself, then the ghost they saw was a damned spirit.
Right.
He isolates the variable, runs the experiment, and watches for the reaction. And the reaction is explosive.
Yeah.
I mean, Claudius halts the play, demands light, and flees in absolute terror. The hypothesis is confirmed. The data is indisputable.
But let's look at the aftermath of that undeniable confirmation, because I feel like that is where the tragedy truly takes root. The experiment is a total success. The X-ray shows the broken bone, like we said earlier. And yet, the resulting action is entirely absent. Hazlitt points out, with devastating clarity, that Hamlet rests entirely satisfied with the success of his intellectual exercise.
Yeah, he doesn't draw his sword. He doesn't rally the guards.
Nothing. He just revels in the dopamine hit of being proven right. He jokes with Horatio about earning a fellowship in a company of actors. He tells himself the mental victory is sufficient.
Because for a mind whose ruling passion is thought, proving the theorem feels identical to solving the problem. Hazlitt notes that Hamlet has proven his uncle's guilt to his own satisfaction, and that inward intellectual satiation just replaces the need for outward execution.
Wow.
The cognitive dissonance here is profound. He substitutes knowing the truth for acting upon the truth.
Let's challenge that premise for a second, though. I mean, is Hazlitt being entirely fair here? In the context of a highly volatile, potentially dangerous royal court, isn't deep, calculated thought a virtue?
It's a fair question.
Because we live in a society that constantly preaches the value of gathering data, of risk assessment, of making informed, evidence-based decisions, look before you leap. Why does Hazlitt, and ultimately Shakespeare, condemn this prudence as a fatal flaw?
That is the essential tension of the whole thing. Prudence is a virtue, yes. But Hamlet himself identifies the exact moment when prudence curdles into something malignant.
Oh, interesting.
In one of his most introspective soliloquies, he scrutinizes his own inability to move forward. He defines his condition as thinking too precisely on the event.
Thinking too precisely.
Right. He isn't merely gathering necessary data anymore. He's obsessively parsing the data until the mandate for action just completely dissolves. He delivers this brutal self-diagnosis, realizing that his hesitation is born of a thought which quartered, half but 1 part wisdom, and ever 3 parts coward.
3 parts coward. Wow, that is a staggering admission. It just strips away the whole veneer of intellectual superiority.
It really does.
When we translate this into the realities of the 21st century, it becomes the ultimate indictment of our modern analysis paralysis. I mean, think about the knowledge economy we operate in. You can spend 8 months researching the biomechanics of running, right?
Oh yeah, buying the optimal heart rate monitors.
Exactly. Cross-referencing nutritional spreadsheets, subscribing to all the optimization podcasts, you accumulate a mountain of theoretically perfect data, but you never actually lace up your shoes and step out the front door and just do a push-up or go for a run.
And the danger is that the research phase mimics the sensation of momentum.
Yes.
Hazlitt argues that Hamlet constantly finds some vague pretense that flatters his propensity to think, which instantly diverts him from his previous purposes. The intellectual refinement becomes an incredibly sophisticated, socially acceptable shield against the vulnerability of action.
Because action is scary.
Exactly. We convince ourselves we are preparing, when in reality we are hiding.
So the reflection demanded of you right now, as you listen to this, is to do a rigorous audit of your own preparation phases. Are you truly gathering the necessary tools to execute a goal, or are you utilizing relentless research as a sophisticated avoidance mechanism?
Are you shielding yourself from the messy, uncontrolled reality of actually doing the work?
Right. Because while we can critique Hamlet's overthinking, if we are to derive practical wisdom from this, we really have to look at the environment forcing him into this state. The context he is operating in isn't a vacuum. It is fundamentally toxic.
It is entirely necessary to map the terrain of that toxicity. To understand the depth of Hamlet's psychological fracture, we have to recognize the sheer scale of the systemic rot he is confronting.
Yeah.
He is not navigating a minor career transition or like a standard family dispute. His reality has undergone a catastrophic, violent inversion. The noble king is dead, and within an astonishingly brief window, before the shoes she wore to the funeral were even broken in, as Hamlet observes his mother, Gertrude, marries his uncle Claudius, who immediately seizes the throne.
Frailty, thy name is woman.
Right.
And the atmosphere Shakespeare constructs to introduce this reality is soaked in paranoia and spiritual decay. You don't even need the plot details to feel the anxiety.
No, you feel it immediately.
Look at the opening scene on the battlements of Elsinore. It's freezing.
Yeah.
The air bites shrewdly. The guards are jumpy, and Francisco admits he is sick at heart. The psychological unease of the entire nation is manifesting in the physical environment. And out of that frigid darkness emerges the ghost, armed for war.
The imposition of the ghost is the catalyst for the entire tragedy. It isn't just a supernatural visitation. It is the physical embodiment of a buried, festering trauma demanding to be acknowledged. The ghost shatters the official narrative.
Which was that he was bitten by a snake.
Right. The public was told the king was stung by a serpent in his orchard. But the ghost reveals that the serpent who stung him now wears his crown. Claudius poured a lethally fast-acting poison Hebanon into the king's ear while he slept. And the ghost places an unbearable mandate on Hamlet to exact revenge for a foul and most unnatural murder.
But the mandate isn't merely personal. This is the crucial distinction we have to make. If it were just a revenge plot, we'd have a standard medieval action thriller. But as Marcellus observes, something is rotten in the state of Denmark.
Yes, the rot is structural.
Exactly. Claudius isn't just a murderer, he is the head of state. He has corrupted the court, the advisors, the very fabric of the nation's governance.
And Hazlitt recognizes that Hamlet is forced violently out of his natural disposition because of this. He was built to be a philosopher, a scholar engaging with high ideals. Instead, he is thrust into the center of a preternatural horror. He isn't just tasked with grieving a father, he is tasked with performing radical surgery on the diseased body politic of an entire nation.
While surrounded by spies.
Right. He is surrounded by sycophants, his childhood friends are deployed as spies against him, and his mother's bed is the epicenter of the corruption.
To bring this into our current reality, just imagine inheriting an impossibly massive, generationally toxic debt that you played no part in creating. You are handed the keys to a fundamentally broken, corrupt system, and you are expected to dismantle and rebuild it perfectly, all while actively suffocating under the weight of your own profound personal grief.
It's possible.
The paralysis doesn't just stem from a flaw in Hamlet's character. It is a perfectly rational response to structural inevitability.
And that overwhelming cognitive load is precisely what bridges the gap between Hamlet and the modern listener. Hazlitt makes a transcendent observation here. He argues that anyone who has ever found the world to be a dull blank, anyone who has felt a heavy sadness cling to their heart like an incurable malady, or who looks at the infinite expanse of the universe and feels reduced to absolute nothingness, that person has become Hamlet.
That brings us to the profound misanthropy of the modern mind. We have to look at how Hamlet articulates this to his old-school friends, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. He delivers what might be the most clinically accurate description of profound depressive realism ever recorded.
Oh, so bleak.
He outlines how he has lost all his mirth. He looks out at the physical earth, which he rationally knows is a beautiful, life-sustaining ecosystem, and his mind can only process it as a sterile promontory.
Right.
He looks up at the sky, acknowledging it as a majestical roof fretted with golden fire, but his internal filter reduces it to a foul and pestilent congregation of vapors.
The psychological mechanism at work there is projection. Hazlitt points out how flawlessly Hamlet moralizes on his own internal feelings. He takes the specific, agonizing trauma of his father's murder and his mother's betrayal, and he utilizes it as a lens to color wash the entire cosmos.
He transfers it to everything.
Yes, he transfers his localized distress onto the general account of humanity. It isn't just his uncle who is corrupt. The entire species is fundamentally flawed.
He explicitly states this, too. He acknowledges the objective marvel of human evolution. What a piece of work is a man, how noble in reason, how infinite in faculty. He sees the theoretical potential of humanity, but because his internal state is so shattered, the conclusion he draws is absolute nihilism. Man is nothing but a quintessence of dust.
And we really must examine that specific phrase, quintessence of dust.
Aye.
In Renaissance alchemy, the quintessence was the fifth element, the purest, highest, most refined essence of a substance.
Okay.
By combining the highest possible spiritual concept, quintessence, with the lowest, most degraded physical reality, dust, Hamlet encapsulates the tragic paradox of human existence. We have the capacity for godlike reason, yet we are bound by biological decay and moral frailty.
This maps so perfectly onto the psychological burden of modern hyperconnectivity. I mean, do we all have a bit of Hamlet in us when we doom scroll the news?
Oh, absolutely.
Think about our daily cognitive intake. We are exposed to the tragedies, the political corruption, the climate catastrophes, and the systemic injustices of the entire globe simultaneously, refreshed every second on our screens. We rationally understand that there is beauty, innovation, and profound kindness in the world. But our internal envious mists, to borrow Hazlitt's concept, they filter all of that out.
Because the sheer volume of the rot we perceive paralyzes us. It leaves us feeling entirely impotent.
Exactly.
It is the defining crisis of modern awareness. We possess the godlike reason to comprehend the vastness of global problems, but we lack the operational capacity to fix them. Our intellect becomes a source of torment rather than a tool for liberation. We observe the systemic rot, we feel the infinite weight of it, and we find ourselves utterly immobilized on the sterile promontory of our own awareness.
But the brilliance of this text is that it doesn't just diagnose the paralysis. It provides a brutally honest examination of how we attempt to navigate it. If thinking without acting is Hamlet's tragedy, what happens when someone acts constantly, driven by habit and survival, completely divorced from moral thought?
Now we're getting to the foils.
Yes, that brings us to Polonius, the Lord Chamberlain. If we want to derive practical daily wisdom, we really have to dissect the breathtaking hypocrisy of this character.
Polonius serves as the ultimate foil to Hamlet's over-intellectualization. He is the chief counselor to the king, a man who has survived regime changes through sheer political adaptability, and he's universally recognized for dispensing what appears to be unassailable proverb-like wisdom.
Oh yeah, he's full of it.
When his son Laertes is departing for France, Polonius delivers a masterclass in behavioral advice. He advocates for profound discretion. Give thy thoughts no tongue, nor any unproportioned thought his act. He preaches financial independence. Neither a borrower nor a lender be. And he concludes with an absolute mandate for integrity. This above all, to thine own self be true, and it must follow, as the night the day. Thou canst not then be false to any man.
I mean, that speech has been commodified into oblivion. It is cross-stitched onto pillows. It's quoted in graduation speeches, framed in corporate boardrooms. It sounds like the pinnacle of ethical philosophy.
It really does.
But the action that immediately follows this speech reveals a terrifying psychological disconnect. Almost the very next time we see Polonius, he is dispatching a servant, Reynaldo, to Paris. And what is Reynaldo's mission? To aggressively spy on Laertes.
His own son.
His own son. Polonius instructs his servant to fabricate slanderous rumors to accuse his own son of gambling, heavy drinking, or frequenting brothels solely to gauge how the Parisian locals react to the rumors, just as a test.
The contradiction is so stark that for centuries, critics actually accused Shakespeare of sloppy characterization. They thought, how could a man capable of articulating such high-minded ethical truths engage in such petty, manipulative espionage against his own blood?
Yeah, it seems like two different characters.
But Hazlitt defends the architecture of Polonius with incredible insight. He argues that this isn't an error in writing, it is a masterstroke of psychological realism. Polonius perfectly embodies the chasm between our intellectual understanding of virtue and the deeply ingrained moral habits that actually dictate our behavior. He gives advice sincerely as a father, but acts foolishly as a courtier.
That distinction between intellectual understanding and moral habit is the key. Hazlitt is exposing the brain's dual operating systems. When Polonius speaks to his son, he is accessing his intellectual reservoir, drawing upon the accumulated theoretical wisdom of human experience. He speaks sincerely in that moment.
Yes, he believes what he's saying.
But when it comes time to actually operate in the world, his survival habits take over. And his habits were forged in the paranoid, cutthroat environment of a corrupt political court.
Exactly. His intellect knows that being true to oneself is the highest good. But his neurological pathways are wired for suspicion, indirectness, and manipulation. He explicitly tells Reynaldo to use a bait of falsehood to catch a carp of truth. He believes that reality can only be understood through deception. His theoretical ethics are pristine, but his operational mechanics are entirely compromised.
So we have to turn that lens directly onto ourselves, because it is incredibly easy to judge Polonius. But the reflection required here is to audit our own daily hypocrisy. Are you being true to your own self, or are you just playing a part, depending on who you're talking to?
That is the big question.
How often do we dispense perfectly curated, Pinterest-worthy advice to our friends, only to act like complete hypocrites in our own lives? You tell your best friend they need to immediately leave a toxic, unfulfilling relationship, while you simultaneously endure years of emotional neglect in your own. You passionately advise a colleague to establish rigid boundaries against burnout, yet you are answering emails at 11:30 p.m. on a Saturday.
The vital question we must ask ourselves is whether our articulated values are actually governing our behavior, or if they're merely performances we put on for different audiences. Are we truly living the ethics we espouse, or are we, like Polonius, relying on our high-minded advice to mask our own adaptive, survival-driven dysfunctions?
The practice derived from this is relentless behavioral auditing. We must examine the friction between what we say we believe and what we actually do. Because if we don't, we become Polonius, spouting elegant poetry about integrity while simultaneously setting manipulative traps in our own lives. And that disconnect between high-minded theory and messy reality leads us to one of the most frustrating obstacles to growth embedded in the text.
Yes, the illusion of the perfect action.
Exactly.
This is a profound barrier to progress, and it is illustrated in what is arguably the most psychologically tense scene in the entire play. Following the success of the mousetrap experiment, Hamlet finally possesses the undeniable empirical proof of Claudius's guilt. The hypothesis is validated.
Did trap work?
The trap worked perfectly, and immediately after, Hamlet stumbles upon the absolute ideal physical opportunity to execute his revenge. He finds Claudius completely alone, unguarded, kneeling in a private chamber, attempting to pray. The king is entirely vulnerable. Hamlet draws his sword. The moment has arrived. He says, "Now might I do it, Pat?" Now he is praying.
The tension in that moment is unbearable. The entire narrative trajectory demands that he strike, and then the intellectual machinery kicks in, and he halts.
He literally stops himself.
He physically sheathes the weapon. And the justification he constructs for stopping is this labyrinth of theological overthinking. He reasons that because Claudius is in the act of prayer, his soul is momentarily cleansed. If he kills him now, Claudius will bypass purgatory and go directly to heaven.
The logic Hamlet employs is chillingly precise, yet entirely self-defeating. He argues that killing Claudius now would be higher in salary, not revenge. It would be doing him a favor.
Right.
He contrasts this with the death of his own father, who was murdered in his sleep, with all his sins broad-blown as flush as May, meaning he had no opportunity to repent and is now suffering in purgatory. Hamlet determines that a perfectly balanced revenge requires him to wait until Claudius is engaged in an act that has no relish of salvation in it, when he is drunk, asleep, enraged, or in the incestuous bed. He demands that his revenge be not just physically fatal, but spiritually damning.
But we have to debate this for a second. Let's look at the theological framework Hamlet is operating within. If he truly believes that killing a praying man sends him to eternal paradise, while his own beloved father burns in purgatory, isn't his hesitation entirely justified? I mean, in that paradigm, killing him now isn't justice, it's a reward. Why does Hazlitt, and why should we, view this as cowardice rather than rigorous principled justice?
Because Hazlitt recognizes the psychological mechanism of motivated reasoning. He pierces right through the theological justification, labeling it a refinement in malice.
A refinement in malice.
Yes. Hazlitt's critique is that this extreme, almost diabolical demand for flawless cosmic justice is nothing more than a highly sophisticated excuse to avoid the visceral, terrifying reality of plunging a sword into another human being. The theological framework is merely a convenient shield. Because Hamlet demands that the conditions for action be absolutely philosophically perfect, he guarantees that the action will never occur. Because he cannot have his revenge perfectly, he misses it altogether.
He weaponizes perfectionism to legitimize his own paralysis. That is the devastating truth. And we utilize the exact same mechanism today. We disguise our deep-seated fears as having high standards.
All the time.
Think about the modern professional who desperately needs to leave a toxic, soul-crushing job. They create a matrix of optimal conditions that must be met before they resign. I need to wait until the macroeconomic climate stabilizes. I need exactly 9 months of living expenses perfectly liquid. I should wait until after the annual review so my resume has a clean narrative.
Or consider interpersonal dynamics. We avoid necessary, painful conversations by waiting for the ideal emotional landscape. My partner had a stressful week at work. I shouldn't bring up our systemic relationship issues now. I'll wait until the weekend.
Right, but then the weekend is occupied with social obligations, so it gets deferred to the hypothetical vacation, which is deemed too precious to ruin with conflict. The delay is perpetual because the perfect time is an illusion.
The uncomfortable wisdom we have to extract here is that waiting for optimal conditions is almost always cowardice in disguise. We construct these elaborate, highly rationalized barriers because we are terrified of the messy, unpredictable fallout of taking action. The obstacle to our growth is the failure to recognize that progress requires acting in imperfect, compromised conditions. By demanding a flawless execution, we forfeit the opportunity entirely.
And we must recognize that this failure to act, this chronic delay, is not a neutral state. Avoiding action does not freeze the timeline. The world continues to turn, and the consequences of our paralysis cascade outward. This brings us to a crucial need for discernment.
Right. Distinguishing enduring wisdom from the cautionary tale.
Exactly. We tend to romanticize the brooding intellectual overthinker. Hazlitt himself calls Hamlet the most amiable of misanthropes. But we must strip away the romanticism and examine the collateral damage of living entirely within the abstract theater of your own mind.
The collateral cost of Hamlet's philosophical high-wire act is catastrophic. Because he is so entirely consumed by his internal cosmic crisis, he becomes dangerously negligent regarding the actual lives of the people intersecting with his reality. He treats the common rules of life loosely.
Let's trace the destruction. He confronts his mother in her chamber with such violent intensity that she fears for her life. When he hears Polonius call out from behind the tapestry, he blindly stabs through the fabric, casually murdering the old man. And his immediate reaction is chillingly devoid of empathy. Dead for a ducat. Dead. He dismisses the corpse as a wretched, rash, intruding fool.
The compartmentalization required to execute that action and immediately intellectualize it is profound. He views the people around him not as autonomous human beings, but as minor variables in his grand personal equation. He intercepts the letter carried by his childhood friends Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, alters the mandate, and casually sends them to their deaths in England, explicitly ensuring they are killed without even the grace of shriving time to confess their sins.
But the most devastating manifestation of this intellectual narcissism is Ophelia. If we want to understand the true danger of a mind detached from grounded compassion, we have to look at what happens to her. She is arguably the only entirely innocent character in the play. She is unequipped for the political machinations of the court, yet she is utilized as a pawn by her father and simultaneously treated with erratic, calculated cruelty by Hamlet.
Hazlitt dwells on Ophelia, describing her as a character of exquisite touchingness. Her descent into madness is not a sudden break. It is the agonizing fragmentation of a vulnerable mind forced to bear the brunt of powerful men's chaotic, self-absorbed games. Hamlet assumes his antic disposition, his fake madness, and directs a barrage of misogynistic vitriol at her, famously screaming at her to get thee to a nunnery.
Yeah.
He destroys her reality, murders her father, and abandons her to the emotional wreckage.
The scene where her mind finally shatters is one of the most haunting sequences in literature. She wanders the sterile stone halls of the castle, entirely unmoored from reality, handing out specific botanical symbols to the corrupt court.
The flowers.
Yes. She hands out rosemary for remembrance and pansies for thoughts. She gives fennel and columbines to the king, symbolizing flattery and deceit. And she keeps rue, the bitter herb of grace and sorrow, for herself. It is a profoundly poetic, yet horrifyingly visceral demonstration of psychological collapse. And ultimately, it ends in her drowning.
What requires rigorous discernment here is the realization that Ophelia's heartbreak and destruction is the direct result of Hamlet prioritizing his internal philosophical journey over the fundamental emotional safety of those who loved him. The intellect, when entirely severed from active, grounded morality and basic human compassion, mutates into an instrument of profound cruelty.
And this demands a deeply uncomfortable confrontation for the listener. At what point does being a deep philosophical thinker become a dangerous negligence to the people who love us? At what point does your dedication to your own internal complexities, your own career crises, or your own philosophical evolution become a mechanism of destruction to the people in your immediate blast radius?
It's a harsh question, but a necessary one.
Are you so utterly consumed by the narrative of your own trauma or ambition that you are blindly trembling over the psychological needs of your family or your team? You can construct the most profound, intellectually robust justification for your isolation or your erratic behavior, but that internal narrative does not mitigate the external destruction you are causing.
That is the ultimate warning embedded in the tragedy. But Shakespeare does not leave us entirely stranded in the wreckage of Hamlet's mind. In the final act, he executes a breathtaking structural zoom-out. He shifts the perspective from the localized tragedy of the Danish court to the absolute, universal baseline of the human condition.
Right.
He does this in the iconic churchyard scene, connecting the narrative directly to the ancient wisdom tradition of memento mori, the practice of remembering your own mortality.
The architecture of Act 5, Scene 1, is brilliant. We open in a graveyard, and the contrast Shakespeare establishes here is striking. We are introduced to two clowns, gravediggers, who are preparing the earth for Ophelia's burial. And the primary gravedigger is the antithesis of Hamlet. He is hyperliteral, entirely grounded in the physical reality of dirt and bone.
To him, death is just a job.
Exactly. It is manual labor. He literally sings a cheerful ballad about the fleeting nature of youth and love, while casually, violently tossing centuries-old human skulls out of the grave to make room for fresh bodies.
The gravedigger exists entirely in the present tense of survival, and then Hamlet enters this space. For Hamlet, every skull unearthed is a catalyst for an expansive cosmic tragedy. He observes a skull being thrown against the ground and immediately attempts to construct its lost identity. Was it a politician who thought he could outsmart God? Was it a courtier? Was it a lawyer whose skull's now filled with dirt instead of property deeds and legal statutes? Hamlet asks, did these bones cost no more the breeding but to play at law gets with them? Mine ache to think on it.
We see the collision of two completely different operating systems. The gravedigger is physically submerged in the earth, dealing with the undeniable mechanics of biological decay, while Hamlet is hovering above the grave, desperately trying to map intellectual meaning onto empty bone. But the philosophical spiral reaches its terminal velocity when the gravedigger hands Hamlet a very specific artifact, a skull that has been buried in the earth for 23 years, the skull of Yorick.
This is the moment the abstraction collapses. Yorick was the king's jester. He was a man Hamlet knew intimately in his childhood, a man who carried the young prince on his back, who poured a flagon of Rhenish wine on the gravedigger's head. Hamlet takes the skull, and for the first time he cannot intellectualize it away. The physical reality of the bone in his hand forces a visceral confrontation. Alas, poor Yorick. I knew him, Horatio, a fellow of infinite jest, of most excellent fancy.
He stares directly into the empty, dirt-filled eye sockets. He remembers the lips he kissed, now gone. He tells the skull to go to his mother's chamber and deliver a message. No matter how much makeup she applies, no matter how thickly she paints her face to hide her age or her guilt, to this favor she must come.
Yes.
But Hamlet's mind, true to its nature, cannot stop at the personal realization. He has to take it to the absolute logical extreme. He begins to trace the biological trajectory of the greatest figures in human history.
He turns to Horatio and asks an incredibly blunt question. Did Alexander the Great look like this in the earth? Did he smell like this? Horatio confirms that he did, and Hamlet proceeds to track the brutal mathematics of biological decay. Alexander died, Alexander was buried, Alexander returned to dust. That dust is part of the earth. We use the earth to make loam. And what is the ultimate destiny of that loam? It might be used to stop up a hole in a wooden beer barrel to keep the winter wind out.
He applies the exact same logic to Julius Caesar. Imperious Caesar, dead and turned to clay, might stop a hole to keep the wind away. He takes the men who conquered the known world, men whose intellect and capacity for action shaped human history, and reduces them to utilitarian spackle for a keg of ale.
It is the total collapse of the intellectual ego. It strips away every layer of societal pretense, political maneuvering, and philosophical exceptionalism. Whether you are the corrupt king of Denmark, a brilliant scholar prince paralyzed by overthinking, a manipulative courtier like Polonius, an innocent victim like Ophelia, or a literal laborer digging the graves, the eternal destination is identical. It is an aggressively humbling reality check that cuts horizontally across all cultures, hierarchies, and eras.
It is the great, undeniable equalizer, and it forces the ultimate comparative truth. No matter your resume, your wealth, or how many armies you commanded, we all end up in the exact same dirt. And so, if the final equation always results in the same dust, what is the inherent value of the actions we are agonizing over right now? Does recognizing that our grandest achievements and our deepest failures all eventually decompose into the soil free us? Does the insignificance of it all liberate us to act courageously in the present moment, or does it simply validate our paralysis? Why bother acting at all if Caesar ends up as clay on a wall?
Hamlet wrestles with that exact tension until the moment he is poisoned in the final scene. It is the inescapable paradox of consciousness. But as we synthesize this deep dive, I want to leave the listener with one final, deeply provocative proposition from William Hazlitt.
Okay, let's hear it.
We noted at the beginning that Hazlitt believed the true reality of the play exists solely in the reader's mind. But he extended that argument to its absolute radical limit. He argued that Hamlet's a text that fundamentally should not be acted on a physical stage.
Wait, really? Arguably the most famous piece of theatrical writing in human history shouldn't be performed? How does he justify that?
He believed that the physical embodiment of the character inevitably diminishes the infinite scale of the text. Hazlitt observed the legendary actors of his era. He watched John Philip Kemble and felt he played Hamlet like a man encased in armor, too rigid, too deliberate. He watched Edmund Kean, who played it with manic intensity, full of sharp angles and abrupt, splenetic starts. Hazlitt concluded that no human actor could ever capture the yielding flexibility of Hamlet's mind. He described Hamlet's consciousness as an undulating, wave-like entity, a soul constantly in flux, capable of encompassing the entire universe in one thought and collapsing into profound nihilism the next. The moment you force that infinite psychological complexity into a single physical body on a stage with a specific voice and specific gestures, you irrevocably narrow it. You lose the boundless internal world.
So, as you disconnect from this deep dive and return to the mechanics of your day, I leave you to mull on the implications of that thought. If Hamlet's mind is deemed too complex, too fluid, and too infinitely layered to ever be accurately represented to the outside world by another human being, what about yours? Can we ever truly share our deepest, most complex internal struggles with the outside world? Or are we forced to accept that the truest, most beautifully complicated parts of who we are will remain forever confined to the private, unactable theater of our own minds, completely unknowable to anyone but ourselves?
It is an incredibly isolating concept, but perhaps it is that very isolation that makes the pursuit of human connection so vital and so necessary.
That's the heart of this section. This is Wisdom for the Present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.